We're very privileged to have a presidential candidate visiting our campus, Dr. Jill Stein. Dr. Stein will be introduced momentarily. I wanted to take a moment to also introduce Professor MAJFUD, who's a member of the School of Humanities. He's the one who arranged this, and you may not know this about Professor MAJFUD, but he's something of a celebrity in the Spanish-speaking world. He's very present across Spanish language media, and that's how this event came to be, because the Green Party is interested not only in the United States, but having a global reach. So this conversation between Professor MAJFUD and Dr. Stein. So I'd like to introduce the Executive Director of Jacksonville University's Public Policy Institute to say a few words. That's Rick Mullaney. So come on up, Rick.
Well, good afternoon, or close to evening. Good evening, everybody. As Professor Kimbrough told you, my name is Rick Mullaney. I'm the Executive Director of the Public Policy Institute. On behalf of Jacksonville University President Tim Cost, the Board of Trustees, Jacksonville University, and the Stein College of Fine Arts and Humanities, I want to welcome all of you to this very special conversation, and a warm and special welcome to Dr. Stein, who is running for President of the United States as the candidate for the Green Party. By the way, that election date is just over 60 days away, a truly historic election. We're very pleased to have her on campus. She is a physician. She went to Harvard for undergraduate school, graduating magna cum laude a long time ago, but I like to mention that because we believe in great academic standards here at Jacksonville University too. She went on to Harvard Medical School. She was a practicing physician, and in the 1990s, she began to notice that the toxic exposure, the link of toxic exposure, was having a tremendous impact on health and illness and well-being, and it began a career in addition to being a physician, and that is as an activist. At the Public Policy Institute, we call this somebody interested in public policy, and she became an advocate in a number of areas, and I'd like to outline a few of those for you. In the 1990s, she began, and this has continued into this very day, fighting for a healthy environment and the closure of toxic facilities and improving air quality standards for coal plants. That included, by the way, and she was in Massachusetts at the time, she helped lead the fight to clean up the filthy 5 coal plants in Massachusetts. She helped close a toxic medical waste incinerator in Lawrence, Massachusetts, which is one of the poorest communities in New England. She saw, by the way, she became a big advocate for campaign finance reform when she saw the effect that lobbyists and campaign contributions were having on health, environmental, and worker protection. And she used that, and she worked to help pass the clean election law by voter referendum in Massachusetts. Dr. Stein co-founded the Massachusetts Coalition for Healthy Communities, a nonprofit organization that fought for health and the well-being of Massachusetts communities, including healthcare, local green economies, environmental protection, labor rights, and grassroots democracy. She also helped lead the effort to secure a Green Future ballot initiative to move subsidies from fossil fuels to renewable energy and to create green jobs. These are just some, and they continue to this day. With that passion for what we like to call public policy and others call career activism, no surprise that she would run for elective office. And by the way, she became the Green Rainbow Party candidate and running for governor of Massachusetts in 2002 and 2010. Unsuccessful in those bids, ran as a third party. And then, as many of you may know, she ran for president in 2012. That was the year Barack Obama won, getting about 500,000 votes. She ran again in 2016, the year Donald Trump won, getting about 1.5 million votes, and been very successful this year in 2024 in getting on the ballot, because remember how this is done. This is done in 50 states. It's an electoral college. You need to be on the ballot in all 50 states. And getting a very favorable ruling from the Wisconsin Supreme Court recently that's allowing her to stay on the ballot in Wisconsin. A whole separate conversation we can have as to why some parties might spend millions of dollars to keep people off ballots, when in fact it's so hard for third parties to get on ballots. But what's important for this election, in many elections, the swing states, is being on the ballot in the big blue wall, which is Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. Very important areas for the outcome of this election, as well as Arizona and Nevada, North Carolina, I think working towards Georgia. All that's a long way of saying that Dr. Stein could have a very significant impact, both in policy and otherwise, on this year's presidential race. And we're very pleased to have this discussion led, as you just heard, by Dr. Jorge MAJFUD, who teaches Spanish and International Relations here at Jacksonville University. So I hope all of you will join me in welcoming Dr. Stein and Professor MAJFUD for this great conversation.
Okay, Jill, thank you very much for accepting our invitation to come to Jacksonville University. I didn't plan this, but we have to start with very bad news. A few minutes ago, we learned that a new shooting in a school in Georgia between Athens and Atlanta, I think it's called Appalachian High School, something like that, where 4 people were killed, 2 teachers and 2 students. In those cases, usually you have to expect a bigger number, you know, unfortunately. And this is unfortunately a never-ending story that is in some way connected to our conversation today. For example, connected to the lobbies problem. Would you like to comment briefly about that tragedy?
Sure, and again, thank you so very much for the invitation. Thank you all for coming out on this challenging day with weather that would get in the way of any normal person. So this is definitely a strong, motivated crowd. Thank you for coming out. Yeah, this news about the school shooting in Georgia is absolutely tragic. Both the loss of life and the fact that it's a 14-year-old child, apparently now in custody for doing the shooting. So this is just tragedy upon tragedy. And the fact that this is so commonplace now in the US that we've had at this point, I don't know what the number is, but it's lots of mass shootings. It's lots and lots. In spite of the strong feelings of the American people who want common sense gun control. The Second Amendment is here to stay, at least for the foreseeable future, but the American people want action, common sense action, which has enormous support for things like an assault weapons ban, the ban on further sales, and a voluntary buyback program, for waiting periods, for raising the age of purchase, for closing the so-called gun show loopholes, for red flag laws that clarify when gun owners are in a very dangerous position at risk for doing harm to others or to themselves. There are many things that we can do to reduce gun violence within the limits of the law. And unfortunately, we have very powerful interests, in this case the NRA, but there are many other examples of powerful lobbies who basically buy their way into either action or more commonly non-action to prevent the passage of laws that are broadly supported by the American people. And I would add that it's not only the power of lobbyists, but it's the very essence of our political system, which is bought and paid for by very big money. And it's well established that laws that move, policies that actually get passed in the US Congress are those that have the support of very powerful financial interests. There was a study done at Northwestern and Princeton maybe 10 years ago, something like this, a definitive study of decades worth of policy, which established very clearly that there is a near zero relationship between what the public's priorities are and what Congress actually passes. So this great tragedy that we're hearing about today, which is so commonplace, which could be greatly reduced, is unfortunately the rule and not the exception for how laws either get passed or don't pass, and whose interests our elected officials are serving in the current political climate. And I should just add, that's part of the reason why the Green Party exists. That's why people like me run for office outside of the system of big money politics, so that we can have policies that actually meet the needs and the really strong, urgent interests of the American people. Because we don't take that money, we do not take corporate money, we do not use the loopholes like super PACs, for example, which allows single donors to pour in millions, actually unlimited amounts of money, so-called dark money. There are many end runs around the rules of campaign finance, so-called victory funds, which began, I think, with the Hillary Clinton campaign in 2016, that allow a single donor to write one check for, now it's up to $1 million. A single donor can write a $1 million check for the presidential campaign, and that money basically gets directed to that campaign, even though the laws, according to the Federal Election Commission, limit donations to $3,300 per election cycle. That's not a small amount of money, but it's a very small amount of money compared to $1 million and more if you're going through super PACs. So again, we have the best democracy money can buy, which is no democracy at all, which accounts for the fact that policies are being sold right out from under us, and it's commonplace for our elected officials to be taking marching orders from their big donors and from the parties that survive on that big donor money rather than meeting the interests of the American people.
Yeah, you mentioned the Second Amendment. You know, the American Constitution is so old that it's like a religious text, so it's a matter of interpretation. Well, a well-organized militia, what does that mean? In the 30s, the Supreme Court had a completely different interpretation to the current interpretation of what does that line mean. And that was basically due to the NRA lobbies that began in the 70s. So it's basically a matter of interpretation and regulation. You don't even need to change the Constitution, but to regulate in the airport, it doesn't apply, the Second Amendment. And many journalists in different countries asked me a very, very simple question. Sometimes simple questions are hard to answer, but it's not going to be hard for you. And they ask how different is Jill Stein and the Green Party, or this Green Party, to the twin parties, the Democrat and Republican. I would say, what is the major difference you can say about the establishment versus the Green Party? Not just the money, we know.
Yeah, okay. So, I think the overarching difference between the Green Party and the establishment parties, really is the money and who therefore pulls the strings. And, so that's kind of like the overarching framework. But what that then results in is the fact that Greens can advocate to meet the really urgent needs of regular everyday people. We're not out there fighting for what the lobbyists want. We're out there fighting for what regular people want. So what is that? It's things like health care as a human right for everyone. We have a continuing crisis here in the U.S. in spite of the passage of the Affordable Care Act. Healthcare is still not affordable. It's far from it. Even if you are getting your healthcare through the Affordable Care Act, it's a very tough row to hoe. And it's somewhere around, the numbers are now somewhere around 60 million Americans who do not have adequate health care, who either are uninsured or they're not adequately insured. Yet we could have a system like expanded, improved Medicare for All, which basically covers everyone comprehensively. It covers your mental health, your dental care, your eyeglasses, your hearing, your chronic care. If your parents or you or a child need chronic care at home, that's actually covered under Medicare for All. It's not covered currently unless you spend yourself into poverty, and then you can get covered under Medicaid. But if you have chronic conditions, it's very hard. Right now, for example, if you get a diagnosis of cancer, the odds are more than 40% that within 2 years you will have spent down your life savings and may even, lose your house on account of just taking care of your cancer. So the Greens advocate for health care for everyone as a human right. And by the way, through Medicare for All, it actually saves us $500 billion a year, because when you have only one insurance provider instead of hundreds of them, you save so much money on the bureaucracy and the red tape. Right now, we need a whole army of bureaucrats just to figure out what insurance company is going to cover you or not cover you for everything that you need. If you go into a hospital and you need an aspirin, does your insurance company cover the aspirin? And how much of the aspirin do they cover? I mean, it's minutia like this that we are spending actually 1 out of every 3 healthcare dollars now for just the bureaucracy and the red tape. So Medicare does away with all of that. Instead of a 30% overhead, it has more like a 3% overhead. So by consolidating those administrative expenses, we can actually expand healthcare to cover everyone and still have $500 billion left over. So that's one of the main issues for Greens. Another one is the endless wars. The endless wars, which are actually costing us half of our congressional dollars right now, are being spent on the endless war machine. So it's about $1 trillion a year. We advocate for cutting that at least 50%. Right now we're spending more than the next 10 biggest spenders combined. And what does that get us? It gets us a lot of interventions. We've sent the military in 250 times in the last 30 years. That's according to the Congressional Research Service. And it's trillions of dollars that we're spending on major war after major war, which are not making the world a safer place, don't make us safer, get us embroiled in all kinds of conflicts that we should not be involved in. So that's another place where we differ. We say, cut the military budget. Let's have an actual defense policy rather than an offense policy. And let's put those dollars into true security here at home, ensuring that we have the health care, the quality schools, the education. I should mention we also call for public higher education as a human right, covering that for free, which was done in my day, in my era. Higher education was, public higher education was either free or just about free. We call for bailing out the students who are locked into virtually unpayable student debt. We call for paying that off as a major public investment to unleash incredible, productivity in our economy. We know from the GI Bill, every dollar that we spend on higher education is returned 7-fold back into the economy from what we get out of that investment. And I'll just mention one other thing about Greens, aside from our environmental policies and all that, which maybe I'll go into later, but we also call for addressing the housing emergency. We have an absolute housing crisis in this country right now where half of all renters are spending 30 to 50% of their income, which is almost impossible. People are severely financially stressed trying to keep a roof over their heads. We call for rent control on a federal basis right now to stabilize rents. We call for ending the power of private equity to buy up housing right now and basically just hang on to it in order to drive the cost up and lower the supply of housing. We also call for a tenant bill of rights so that you cannot be evicted simply because your landlord wants to upgrade and drive the rent up and gentrify the neighborhood. And we also call for so-called social housing. Back in the Clinton administration, Bill Clinton passed a bill called the Faircloth Amendment that ended public dollars for public housing. It basically ended the institution of public housing and allowed it to basically degrade over the coming decades, so that there's very little public housing and the quality has been just really devastated over the years. We call for investing again in public housing as a social good. We call for housing as a human right in the same way that healthcare should also be a human right. These should not be allowed to be profiteered into absolute unaffordability and create the crisis that we have. For a reasonable investment, we actually call for 15 million units of affordable public housing, which is high quality, which is built according to integrated green principles, meaning they're very energy efficient. They are provided with public transportation so that they don't add to the problems of sprawl and pollution and traffic congestion and all that, and that we protect green space through concentrated housing. And include green space as an essential component of healthy communities and healthy housing. People are much healthier if we have access to green space and recreational space.
Thank you, Jill. I would say that some Democrats will say, well, some proposals are similar to ours, etc. That's our policies, and we are going to go back to the plutocracy problem. But we still have a structural problem with the electoral system. The current electoral system is very indirect and rooted in the legacy of slavery. States like California, Texas, and New York require twice as many votes as Alaska or Mississippi for each elector, undermining the democratic principle of one person, one vote. Additionally, every state, regardless of population, elects 2 senators. So sparsely populated states like Alaska, less than 1 million people live there, have the same Senate representation as populous states like California, almost 40 million people live there. Currently, the real third party is in the US, we may call it abstention party, with about 80 million eligible voters not participating in the 2020 election. Biden received 81 million votes. Many feel their vote doesn't matter in solid red or blue states. For instance, in California, Biden got 11 million votes to Trump's 6 million. Even if 3 to 5 million people voted for the third party, it wouldn't change the electoral distribution due to the winner-take-all system, but it will be very significant, meaningful in many aspects. How difficult do you see this whole system to change and become more democratic without a strong third party? It's very hard to talk about democracy.
Great point. So to summarize, the question is really, how do we create a real system of democracy when there are so many things in our system right now which are quite anti-democratic? And, that includes not only the Electoral College, it includes the first-past-the-post system, which gives all the Electoral College votes to whatever candidate gets the largest chunk, and it may not even be a majority. It is the ballot access laws that make it very hard by design for other choices to appear on the ballot. And we know that the American people are really hungry for more choices. We see this in poll after poll. There's a poll that's run by Gallup I think it's every year actually, that asks people, are they satisfied with the two-party system, or do they see the need for another option? And that number keeps going up and up. It's now at a record 63% of Americans who say, yes, we really need another major political party because the two that we have are doing such a bad job of responding to the public interest. There are many things that contribute to this crisis of democracy, and the difficulty even getting on the ballot to be a choice for the American people who are saying, yes, we need more choices. That is part of the crisis. You may have seen some coverage in the news recently about the challenges to our ballot lines. We are fighting to provide another choice in this election, a choice which is anti-war, anti-genocide, pro-worker, addressing the climate emergency, things that are not actually dealt with at all by the other campaigns. And we're fighting to get into the public discussion, because if you just leave it to the two major players, they're not going to mention, these issues about the genocide, about the endless war machine that's robbing us blind, about the climate crisis. You're not hearing them talk about that, not at all. And the Democrats in particular claim to have solved the problem, but they're not solving the problem in the least. Maybe we'll get to that later. But they provide lip service without actually solving the problem. We know, for example, that both Joe Biden and Barack Obama broke all records for fossil fuel emissions and for exports, and made the U.S. the leading producer of fossil fuels at the same time that they're claiming to be the friends of the climate. Well, no, it doesn't work that way. The climate actually doesn't care about renewable energy. People do, but the climate doesn't. The climate really cares about fossil fuel production. And the Democrats have been every bit as bad as the Republicans, in fact, have exceeded Republicans, both in extraction on public land and the sales of public land for the purpose of fossil fuel extraction, and also for actually the emissions. So this problem is not getting solved at all. And that's why, fundamentally we are fighting to be on the ballot so that we can offer a choice. We also address the crisis of democracy in our system. One of the things I didn't mention was the role of money in politics, which has totally gone off the charts. You may have seen at the Democratic National Convention recently, coverage by, actually it was Chris Cuomo on News Nation, if you saw that.
He mentioned the suites.
Exactly.
Yeah. They cost about from $500,000 to $5 million each. And so they were the donors, basically, and Kamala Harris was, talking about regulating limiting the very wealthy and tax the rich, etc., which was obviously a contradiction. The third party also obviously is relevant, but today the New York Times published a report that shows that in local elections in the U.S., they mentioned 27,400 local elections, and out of those, 14,400 cases had only one candidate on the ballot. That is a single party candidate, mostly Republican in many, Missouri, the report mentioned Missouri, for example. But that is also connected with the plutocracy, and so we can revisit the plutocracy now and what we can call, instead of democracy, that it has a long roots in the U.S. history. Let me read a little bit. The post-Civil War mega corporations continue the legacy of the slave corporation, right? And in 1888, President Rutherford Hayes complained, the real difficulty is with the vast wealth and power in the hands of the few. Hundreds of laws of Congress and state legislatures are in the interest of these men and against the interest of working men. This is the government of the people, by the people, and for the people no longer. It is the government of corporation, by corporation, and for corporation. That was said in 1988 by President Hayes. In 2000, well, you already mentioned 2010, the Supreme Court held that corporate funding to parties cannot be limited under First Amendment, and these limitless donations can sometimes be secret. According to a 2016 USA Today investigation, thousands of laws, they mentioned 10,000 laws, and about, I think, more than 2,000 passed by state legislation were copy and paste of text that congressmen received from big corporations. Another proof of legalized corruption. And I have that note of Kamala Harris you already mentioned. So it looks like the political democracy is trapped into an economic dictatorship. So I see very difficult to a third party in the conditions that you have in the structural votes conditions, money, etc., to change this reality. How is that possible from a practical point of view?
Yeah, great. I mean, that's kind of the $24,000 question. How do we ever change this when the system is so locked down? And I want to come back to that in just a second, but I want to note that, like, as evidence of how hard it is to change, is the fact that, you know, the Democratic Party announced back in March that they had hired an army of lawyers to throw competitors like myself off the ballot, and RFK and Cornel West, and, you know, they're trying to throw their competitors off the ballot by hiring lawyers to basically conduct lawfare, which is essentially looking for little technical gotchas, violating the spirit of the law and finding little ways to end their competition, which is extremely anti-democratic from the get-go. They didn't stop there, though, and they've challenged us in 3 states. So far, we've prevailed. We've been able to fight them in court and to win and secure our ballot status so far in these 3 states. One more challenge to go right now. But they also started advertising for infiltrators and spies, and we actually have that job posting to manage infiltrators and spies in order to wreck our ballot access drives. And they also hijacked our public funding. There's just a little bit of public funding right now that was part of this system to create an alternative to corporate funding so candidates wouldn't have to sell their souls. So that program still exists. We are one of the few candidates and parties that actually use it. They were to have provided us about $300,000 almost 2 months ago for part of our ballot access drives, and they refused to provide that money. They found a technical excuse basically to hang on to it. We may be getting it in coming weeks, but they blocked it also to make it even harder to get on the ballot. You know, so, and this is the Democratic Party. Let me just describe one other thing that they did. This was in 2022, where they impersonated the Green Party, and they called up people who had signed the petition of one of our candidates running for Senate in North Carolina in 2022, running at the federal level for Senate. And they called people who had signed his petition and told them that they were the Green Party. They weren't the Green Party. These were people being managed by the Democratic National Committee, the DNC, hired people to basically fraudulently misrepresent themselves as saying that they were the Green Party and they wanted names taken off the petition because they decided they didn't want this guy running for office anymore. But they happened to call the co-chair of the Green Party and tell him that they were the Green Party, and would he please take his name off the ballot petition. And he had the presence of mind to record the conversation, which was then brought to court, and the Democrats were convicted and found guilty of so-called operating with dirty hands. I don't know why they don't call that fraud and election interference. I mean, we talk about election interference from foreign powers based on tweets. How is it not election interference when you're fraudulently misrepresenting yourselves in order to get candidates taken off the ballot? So, you know, the bottom line here is that people always talk about the Republicans and how they interfere with democracy after the election. Well, the Democrats also do it in advance of the election, and they do it shamelessly. And, you know, it's not like we have to wait for Donald Trump for fascism to get here. We have fascism, authoritarianism, wherever you want to draw the line, but this is completely anti-democratic, and, you know, that is being done. So back to your question, so how do we ever solve this problem when they're in charge and they kind of have control over the airwaves, they have control over mainstream media, you know, but they don't have perfect control, put it that way, and they especially don't have control over social media. In the year 2020, as you pointed out, it was 1 out of every 3 eligible voters who did not vote because they didn't buy what was being rammed down their throats, the candidates. And back in 2016, the numbers were even higher that did not vote. It was more like 42% of eligible voters, something like that. It was a higher percentage that was not voting. So the American people are not happy, and they are looking for other options. And the question is, when is that tipping point going to be hit? Because right now people are struggling against incredible economic and racial disparities. A younger generation has basically been locked out of survival. Polls of young people now, under age 25, half of young people say that they are hopeless about the future, and 1/4 of young people are actually saying that they've contemplated harming themselves within 2 weeks of the poll because things are that bad. And things are not going well when you have two major parties who are bought and paid for by the war machine, by Wall Street, by the health insurance and big pharma. When they're running the show, it's not working for ordinary people. And ordinary people have really reached the end of their rope. Over 60% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck and are not happy about it. So the question is, when will we break through? In this race, because the genocide is it is a red line for many voters who are saying they're not going to hold their nose and vote for genocide, not with either party. So we're seeing a whole lot of interest and organized power coming into our campaign and into the Green Party now, which suggests that maybe we're getting to a tipping point, because the genocide doesn't stand alone. It's part of this very overblown military-industrial complex, which is robbing us blind and depriving us of the things that we really urgently need right now. So, it's anybody's guess what will happen in this election. A poll was just released, I think, 3 days ago, something like that, of Muslim American voters showing that I am tied with Kamala Harris now. Basically, the vote is divided between the two of us. This is absolutely unprecedented and represents a huge drop in support for the Democrats. Arab Americans and Muslim Americans are taking the genocide very seriously because they are up close and personal to what's going on there. And Americans in general are very personally impacted by the squandering of our tax dollars on the endless war machine and the failure to actually provide health care and housing and quality education, things that countries far poorer than us, have a better shot at than we do here in this country. So I just want to make the point that this is a moving target right now. And to quote Frederick Douglass, power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has and it never will. So that's number one. If we don't stand up for what we want, we're never going to get it. People are forever being intimidated out of voting for what they want, whether it's peace in Palestine and Israel, whether it is cutting the war budget and putting that money into education here. People are forever being told, no, don't vote for what you need. Vote for whatever the powers that be tell you to do. And the question is, when are we going to break away from that? Well, the companion to the Frederick Douglass quote is Alice Walker's saying, the biggest way people give up power is by not knowing we have it to start with. If you add up the number of people who want to end the genocide right now, the number of people who are locked into student debt, that's 44 million. The number of people who are struggling with their health care, and that's about 60 million right now. You have more than a quorum. You have more than the numbers needed to win a three-way presidential race. So, in my mind, the answer to that question about how do we break through, the most critical thing is for us to exercise the courage of our convictions and to flick the switch in our own minds from being powerless, which is what we're told all the time, to being powerful. to actually having the power to cast our votes and stand up, whether it's 5% or whether it's 51%. You have to start from where you are and build from there and not be intimidated out of your power. Power in democracy is our votes. If we're not using our votes, we're basically contributing to the shutdown of our democracy.
Yes, some of us are waiting for a no 60s in the next decade. That may be more or less what you are suggesting, civil rights movements, etc. But however, in the last 20 years, we have been moving towards the Middle Ages. And now, in a more conscious way, there are some people, particularly in the Republican Party, with Vance, are more in favor of the dark enlightenment. That is a reversal of the equalities, democracy, certain ideals of the illustration, right? Or the dark illustration, they call it in English, I think. So, and that's brings me to another topic, which is freedom of speech and education. That's very important, particularly here in Florida. In June 2021, General Mark Milley responded in Congress about the critical race theory and the accusation of being woke. He said, I've read Mao Zedong, I've read Karl Marx, I've read Lenin. That doesn't make me a communist, he said, close quote. In 2022, just 11 people were responsible for filing 60% of thousands of book challenges. Thousands of books were removed from schools and libraries. Here, Florida is the epicenter, right? Even topics or words like gay or slavery have been limited when not directly silenced. For freedom, the most devastating effect is not only censorship, but self-censorship. On August 2nd, Ray Rodriguez, Chancellor of Board of Governor of States University System of Florida, emailed every Florida public university and college to, I quote, review relevant course resources such as textbooks for either anti-Semitic material and or anti-Israel bias. Any course that contains the following keywords: Israel, Israeli, Palestine, Palestinian, Middle East, Zionism, Judaism, Jewish, or Jews will be flagged for review. So some people and parties win elections repeating freedom, and once in power they practice ban, right? And my question for you, Jill, is why this open attack on academic freedom? Are we finally moving from making free speech irrelevant, like during the slavery? Throughout slavery, we have the First Amendment, freedom of speech, etc. But that was a non-free country. That there was a slavery in course, legal slavery. Everything in the name of freedom. So why this, Jill? This attack, is that because some groups are feeling like during the slavery when everybody were free, even the Confederate States having the Constitution written in 1861, something like the First Amendment, freedom of expression, etc., but they were in favor of slavery. Why that? Because that was not in question for them. So is that because some people are nervous now that they are losing certain privileges, and instead of criticize, they began to legislate and ban? Is that because of a certain fear? Why that?
That's a great question. So the question is basically why this attack on academic freedom, in the form of banning books and banning ideas. And the statistic you pointed out is really incredible, that just 11 people were responsible basically for banning 60% of the books that were banned. Was that in Florida? That must have been in the U.S. In the U.S. I mean, it's
Florida is eccentric, and Texas as well.
11 people were responsible for 60% of book bans. I mean, that tells you how incredibly, anti-democratic this whole regime is. And I want to connect the dots here, because it's not just books that are being banned and ideas that are being banned. We saw with the assault on Julian Assange that went on for about 14 years, an absolute assault on freedom of the press. We're looking at an assault on freedom of speech and the right to protest, which is also under fire, both on campuses as well as, out there in the real world. We're looking at a ban basically on political discourse as well. Just yesterday, actually, we were in Tampa, Florida, where the so-called Uhuru movement, which is basically a left African-American group, is being charged essentially as a foreign agent, that to criticize U.S. foreign policy is being a foreign agent. No, I don't think so. These are like lifelong, deeply held beliefs of these activists who are now being threatened with 15 years in jail for participating in elections and running on their beliefs. I had the same challenge thrown at me in 2016 for basically standing up on the issues, for being an anti-war candidate, for being a anti-nuclear candidate and a pro-peace candidate. I was accused of being a Russian asset, mainly because that was politically convenient. It was a politically convenient charge that was essentially issued by Hillary Clinton and the DNC, who were trying to marginalize me by trying to brand me as a Russian asset. I was investigated for 3 years by the Senate Intelligence Committee because of that, and essentially, eventually proved my innocence, which is ridiculous to have to prove your innocence. You're supposed to be innocent until proven guilty, but the tide is turned when you have a political accusation against you.
Sounds like McCarthyism.
Like what?
McCarthyism.
McCarthyism, exactly. This is a new kind of McCarthyism, which is very full-blown. And that's what's happening on campus. This is what's happening politically. This is part of the effort of the Democratic Party now to shut down its political opposition. This is not what democracy looks like. This is the opposite of democracy. This is why, in my view, we don't have to wait for Donald Trump to see fascism growing in this country. When we have the Israeli Defense Forces training our local police all across the country in these very vicious and horrific, abusive tactics for policing. This is going on not only at the Cop City in Atlanta. There are about 80 such cop cities that are under construction now across the whole country. Unbeknownst to many people, the draft is also back. It's not been activated, but the database is up to date. And if you have kids between, 18 and 25, they are registered in that database, and Uncle Sam knows where you are. We are being essentially railroaded into this very militarized economy, a very militarized society, and the price we pay is our democracy and our rights to free speech, the right to protest. The reason Julian Assange was targeted is because he exposed war crimes, torture, abuse, and corruption. This is the role of journalism. That's what the press is supposed to do. They're not supposed to be lapdogs to power. They're supposed to be watchdogs to power. But we're in a situation right now where we're seeing incredible abuses of power, and that includes this assault on our First Amendment rights, also our Fourth Amendment rights, and our right to privacy and all that. But our basic constitutional protections are under assault. The American people do not like this, do not want this to be debated. This is another reason why we are fighting to be on the ballot and to be in the debates and in the discussion and covered by the media, because the basics of our democracy, our economy, our environment are being sold out from under us to the highest bidder. And this is a very dangerous situation for all of us. And what's going on with the banning of the books, unfortunately, is just one detail in this larger situation. If democracy prevails, we will roll all that back because it does not have public support. But in the same way, you made the point that we're, I think you said, an oligarchy or a plutocracy. You know, we are ruled by the very few and the very rich because our political system is bought and paid for. This is a crisis as money has been more and more concentrated into fewer and fewer hands, to where the richest 3 people in the US now have as much money as 50% of the population. So wealth and power is very concentrated. And in the words of the famous Supreme Court Justice, Louis Brandeis, we have in this country a choice between vast concentrations of wealth or democracy. We can't have both. And unfortunately, in this country, we have chosen vast concentrations of wealth. When wealth is concentrated into very few hands, it finds ways to buy power and to basically, through legalized forms of corruption and sometimes not so legalized, to buy its way to ever greater power. We are in the crisis of that moment right now, and it's absolutely unsustainable and unsurvivable now to the majority of the American public. And the question is, when are we going to have a real debate about this and set it right? That will happen the minute our democracy is unleashed. That's not going to happen from the 2 political parties that are now running the show. We need to open up our democracy and have more voices and more choices so that the American people can actually have a fighting chance.
Thank you, Jill. Let's move to Latin America and then a little bit to immigration. Allow me an introduction about this. After the U.S. took over more than half of Mexican territory, from Texas to California, to expand slavery where it was previously illegal, expansion halted at the Rio Grande. This was to avoid incorporating areas heavily populated by what congressmen of the time considered inferior races. Instead, the U.S. established protectorates and military bases in Latin America. In the 19th century, Washington conducted dozens of military interventions in Latin America to teach the young people, that is why they were called, to govern themselves. This continued into the 20th century. During the Great Depression, the U.S. withdrew Marines from some banana republics, but left behind its local psychopath in their government's dictatorship that lasted for many generations. During the World War II, Washington neglected Latin America, which is why the region recovered a dozen of democracies. But just born, the CIA replaced the N-word with communist in every speech. Once again, Washington sent tsunamis of dollars to finance Latin American armies and coups. In 1959, Senator John F. Kennedy said in Congress, "I don't think giving the aid to South America is to strengthen them against the Soviet Union. This money is down the drain in a military sense, but in the political sense, we hope they make effective use of it." President Nixon confirmed that idea in 1970. I quote, "I will never agree with the policy of downgrading the military in Latin America. They are power centers subject to our influence. The others, the intellectuals, are not subject to our influence." By 1970s, a dozen of democracies in Latin America had been lost, transformed into bloody military dictatorship, were not obedient democracies, guardians of American corporations, freedom of enterprise, and their accomplices, the Latin American oligarchy. The story never ended. Today is practiced in other ways. What would the Green Party foreign policy? What would be a Green Party foreign policy?
So the Green Party foreign policy would be very different. And just to add to what you were describing about what U.S. foreign policy looks like, actually. Since the Second World War, there have been approximately 70, 75 regime change operations, covert, conducted largely by the CIA and by the U.S. regime change operations like overthrowing the democratically elected government of Guatemala in order to prevent land reform, which United Fruit did not want. They did not want to be land reformed out of their monopoly over the land, which was basically starving the peasants. So, the CIA came in to the rescue and overthrew that government and installed one of their own. Same thing in Iran around the same time in the early 1950s, where the government of Iran, the democratically elected government of Iran, was going to nationalize the oil and use the oil supply of Iran for the Iranian people. And the US and the UK came in and overthrew Mossadegh and installed the Shah, a brutal dictator who was there for basically generations, a cruel and vicious dictator who was there essentially until the Islamic Revolution overthrew him. The point here is that when the US has come in to mess with other sovereign nations, we create an incredible mess that lasts for a long time. And this blows back at us as well through global instability, through failed states like in Libya, where there are open air slave markets after US and NATO intervention to overthrow Gaddafi in Libya. You have mass migrations as people flee the desperate conditions of their countries, and continuing terrorist threats. It resolves nothing to basically overthrow governments and install violent dictatorships. It's a disaster. So the Green Party would have none of that. We would move from a foreign policy based currently on military might and economic domination and neocolonialism. We would move from that to a foreign policy based on international law, human rights, and diplomacy, and use that as our guide and not use raw militarism. Instead of enforcing this current concept of a monopolar world, a world dominated by the US empire, instead we would join with the community of nations to be a multipolar world living according to the laws of nations, because it will either be the laws of nations or the laws of the jungle. The US is no longer the dominant economic power, so we are not going, nor are we now the dominant military power. So we need to kind of get with the program and start operating like a mature adult member of the community, not like the bully in the schoolyard, so that we can have a sustainable and peaceful world that will work for all of us, because this monopolar, imperial-dominated world is actually not working for anyone and is extremely unstable. We have at least 3 areas now of very serious conflict. 2 of them are hot wars, obviously around Ukraine and in Israel, Gaza. They're both enlarging hot wars. And then there's a Cold War that could easily turn hot right now around China. And all of these could go nuclear. Not hard to imagine how that could happen. So we are on a very dangerous trajectory on this imperial notion of US domination. So we would leave that behind us and get with the program of a foreign policy based on international law, human rights, and diplomacy that we can all live with.
It's a very dangerous...
Yes. It's 6:35 now, maybe like one more question. And then
Okay, thank you for letting me know that. Very quickly about immigration. Illegal immigrants have a much lower criminal rate than the US citizens, despite having a disproportionate number of young males. Still, every time some of them commit a crime, he immediately makes the headlines, and politicians escalate the criminalization of a vast group that cannot vote and has no lobby. They don't know the language or the laws, but they still manage to find jobs, which are crucial for our society. Unlike outsourcing, they produce and consume here and are ready to work from the first day without the usual government investment of 12 or 20 years of education and healthcare.
We are against illegal immigration, but also against criminalization of a very vulnerable group. Usually, poor, desperate people take Coyote's $10,000 or $15,000 loan to come here illegally. Why this? Because the U.S. immigration laws hate poor workers. In a U.S. embassy, it is better to say that you are a lazy, sluggish person with an exciting bank account than a hard worker if you don't want to be denied a visa. So what are the Green Party ideas for kind of solving or dealing with the immigration problem?
So as Greens, we know that the most important thing we can do to fix the immigration crisis is to stop causing it in the first place through regime change operations, which need to come to an end. We need to respect the sovereignty of other nations. We need to end the war on drugs by treating drug use as a public health issue, not as a criminal issue. And the minute we do that, we pull the rug out from under the drug cartels and their violence, which is also forcing many people to leave their homes. So we, on day one, would legalize marijuana, and we would begin a program to decriminalize other drugs as well in order to basically end the power of the drug cartels. We would also address, the economic exploitation, to look at Haiti, for example, where we overthrew the Aristide government twice, so that, for example, we could then suppress the minimum wage laws, which had raised the minimum wage from something like, I think it was 30 cents an hour up to 60 cents an hour. That was like the minimum wage law, which had been passed. And then when we overthrew Aristide, we were able to suppress that minimum wage law and push it back down in order to protect the profits of basically the clothing industry that was making out like bandits with cheap labor in Haiti. So these are the kinds of policies that create the instability which are driving people here. If you look at the countries, and also we would end the economic sanctions, for example, against Cuba and Venezuela and Nicaragua. Economic sanctions are actually illegal. They are a violation of international law, and they drive incredible instability and drive people to forcing them to flee for their survival here. So number one, we would stop causing the migration crisis in the first place and greatly decompress the numbers of people who are having to flee here. We would also address the climate crisis, by the way, through a Green New Deal here, but also assisting other countries in their efforts to green their economies and cope with the climate crisis, because it is drought that have put millions of farmers out of work that is also driving much of the migration coming here. So we would address these drivers. Some of them can be addressed more quickly than others, like the drug cartels. That can be addressed fairly quickly, but not the other issues. That will take some time. So we want to decompress what's forcing people to flee their homes. And in addition, instead of spending billions of dollars on a wall, which is completely ineffective, all it does is kill people and kill wildlife and destroy ecosystems, instead of spending money on the wall, we will spend the money on the immigration attorneys, on the civil society supports, so that people can be quickly processed. They can get their background checks. We can ensure that we're not allowing people with a history of violent criminal records into the country. We can do those checks expeditiously, give people their papers, and then allow them in with papers so they can go to work. Because when migrants are actually working, they more than pay their own way in their taxes. And contrary to the mythology that's being peddled now, particularly by Republicans, but increasingly Democrats as well, migrants are peaceful. They actually make our communities more peaceful and secure. They are not bringing the drugs. The drugs are crossing the border in portals of entry carried largely by Americans, not by migrants. And also, migrants are hardworking and represent basically a huge economic resource. A recent study showed that over the next decade, migrants are worth basically about $7 trillion worth of economic development for the country. So we can do the right thing by way of, human rights, asylum laws, migrants, but the right thing for this country as well by offloading the drivers that are causing the crisis and by expeditiously processing migrants so that they can go to work and become contributing, vibrant members of our communities. So
Okay, I don't have time to ask about AIPAC, Palestine, Gaza, etc.
I could give you a real quick answer on AIPAC.
Please do.
But very quickly, Mr. Trump confirmed if you want to eliminate Israel, then we don't want you in our country. The positive is very interesting in our country. On August 15, Trump blamed our left-wing media institution for the rise of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism, historically associated with extreme right groups, has been on the rise due to the neo-Nazi revival in both the US and Europe, even before the recent conflict in Gaza. Mr. Trump blamed, I quote, a certain candidate for the presidency, for the President of the United States, which is hard to believe in our colleges and universities. Close quote. I think he was talking about you. Who else? Not Miss Harris, right? How do you respond to this very easy common trap of identifying Zionism with Judaism and anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, for example?
So that's a common mistake to think that Zionism and Judaism are the same thing. They are not the same thing. Zionism was actually regarded with a lot of skepticism within the Jewish religion for a long time. It's only recently that there's been such a strong focus on Zionism. But Zionism is a political ideology. It is not a religion. And we have a duty in this country to look carefully at our wars and the wars that we are sponsoring. I grew up in the Jewish community, attending a Reform synagogue right after the Holocaust, after the Second World War, and my community was coming to terms with the Holocaust, and we came to terms with that genocide by vowing that it would not happen again, not to anyone. And in the community as I grew up, it's not just the perpetrators of genocide that we held accountable. We held accountable the bystanders to genocide, the people who just looked the other way and let it happen. And we vowed that we would never do that. So, to my mind, that's why I am active in fighting against this genocide, because it is a crime against humanity. It is a crime against all of us. This is not a religious conflict. Jews, Christians, and Muslims lived in peace for millennia in Palestine, in Jerusalem. It was only with the arrival of the Zionists that conflict erupted. And that conflict was not just the Zionists against the Palestinians, it was also the Zionists against the Jews and the Zionists against the Christians as well. So there's a lot of just basic education that needs to take place right now. The National Archives of Israel only became available for public inspection and for historians to look at in the 1990s. So starting in the 1990s, there was a whole lot more awareness of what kind of happened even before Israel was founded. The issue was essentially that Zionists were intent on claiming this land, which did not belong to them. There were other occupants there, and having been the victims of a genocide doesn't make it okay for you then to conduct a genocide yourself. So this is a readily solved problem. It's solved by international law. And the International Court of Justice has had several rulings on this, as has the United Nations over and over again. The genocide needs to end. The occupation needs to end. Israel needs to withdraw from Gaza and from the West Bank, which they're also in the process of trying to appropriate now. And the apartheid government of Israel also needs to end, and the ethnic cleansing. This did not begin on October 7th. This has been the story since before actually the founding of the state of Israel. So this began somewhere around 75, 77 years ago, in fact. So this is solved by international law and human rights. To look the other way is to basically give a thumbs up to the torture and murder of children on an industrial scale. The issue is not, the issue of people like myself and most Americans, I must say, 68% of Americans, according to a Gallup poll, a Reuters poll, who want an immediate end to the genocide. That is not anti-Semitic. To say that it's anti-Semitic to object to genocide is like saying that Jews approve of genocide. And to my mind, that is the most anti-Semitic thing that anyone could say. I feel like it's being faithful to the highest principles, not only of Judaism, but of Islam and Christianity and just plain old humanity. To say that we cannot allow this absolutely senseless slaughter for no justification whatsoever to continue. It needs to be stopped, and the rules of international law need to be abided by. We can make this happen with a simple phone call. Ronald Reagan did that when Israel had entered Lebanon pursuing the PLO, which was basically the Hamas of its day. It was the resistance force of its day. And thousands of people were being massacred in Lebanon, and Ronald Reagan picked up the phone and he told Menachem Begin, the current prime minister at that time of Israel, that had to stop, that Israel had to withdraw its troops and had to end the missile strikes and the bombing. It was over that day. Dwight Eisenhower did the same thing when Israel went into Egypt. We need to do the same thing right now. It's as simple as a phone call, and if Israel and Netanyahu, who is a war criminal, will not comply, then the weapons are cut off. We should not, it's actually against U.S. law right now. It is against U.S. law to be providing weapons to countries that are violating human rights, that are interfering with the delivery of humanitarian aid, and which are out of compliance with nuclear weapons treaties, which Israel is by having nuclear weapons in defiance of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So based on 3 laws, it's actually illegal for the United States to be providing military assistance to Israel right now. So we are entirely within our rights. In fact, it is illegal for us not to be doing that right now. And on day one, our administration would do that immediately and ensure that this is a disaster, not just for Gaza and Palestine, this is also a disaster for Israel. And Israel is mobilizing its neighbors against it. Already people are leaving Israel by the droves. Its economy is a mess. Having a fascist state is not compatible with survival, really, for any country in this day and age. And Israel needs to begin complying with international law. We can make that happen. We have the power to do that in the blink of an eye. Otherwise, we are normalizing the torture and murder of children on an industrial scale. We are making mincemeat of international law. We are not going to be top dog around the world for very much longer. So we ourselves need international law here in the U.S. to ensure that we have a world that is survivable for all of us. Because given the weapons that we have right now, not just us, but Russia and China, and probably Iran too. There's a lot of weapons out there that can transcend boundaries readily. We cannot feel just because it's over there, we're safe. We are all in the target hairs. We are all being impoverished by this endless war machine, and we are all endangered by it as well. So we need to step up to the plate and get with the program, start supporting international law instead of tearing it down. And that begins by ending the genocide in Gaza now. Thank you very much.
Ricky, you want to Q&A?
Right now. Unfortunately, we're out of time. However, I hope all of you will join me in thanking Dr. Stein and Dr. MAJFUD for their time today in this discussion, this very lively discussion. All of you who joined me.